The blood-red sunset painted the Montana territory like God's own canvas as Emmett Fitzgerald lowered his sister's body into the shallow grave. The year was 1876, and the wilderness showed no mercy to those who traveled its vast expanses. Margaret had been 26, only 2 years younger than himself, when the consumption finally claimed her. It had been a slow, merciless death, and in the end, she'd withered away to almost nothing, this sister who had once been so full of life. "You should have seen these hills in spring, Maggie," Emmett whispered as he tossed the first shovelful of dirt onto the simple pine box he'd constructed. His voice caught, "All wildflowers and hope." The wind whispered through the ponderosa pines as he continued his grim task. This secluded hillside overlooking the valley had been Maggie's choice. She'd made him promise during those final, lucid moments. "You'll visit together someday, just not yet," she'd told him, her thin fingers clasping his calloused hand with surprising strength. Her eyes had been fever-bright but clear. "Promise me, Em, promise you'll live the life we dreamed about." He hadn't understood her words then, visit together, with whom, but he'd promised anyway, if only to ease her passing. Now, as he tamped down the last of the earth and positioned a crude wooden cross at the head of the grave, those words haunted him. The sun had nearly disappeared behind the distant mountains by the time he finished. Emmett stood, removed his hat, and bowed his head. No prayers came. They dried up long ago, after watching their parents die of cholera back in Ohio after the war, after everything that had driven them west in search of something better. "I'll come back, Maggie," he vowed. "Don't know who I'll bring with me, but I'll come back." With that, he replaced his hat, gathered his tools, and trudged down the hillside to where his horse waited patiently. Thunder, the big black gelding, nickered softly as Emmett approached. "Just you and me now, boy," Emmett murmured, stroking the animal's neck. "Just you and me." Emmett had a small homestead in the valley below, nothing fancy, just a one-room cabin, a modest barn, and a few acres he'd been trying to cultivate. He and Maggie had arrived 3 years earlier with dreams of building something lasting. Now those dreams lay buried alongside her. As he approached his cabin, the emptiness of it struck him anew. No lamp glowed in the window, no smell of coffee or stew greeted him, just darkness and silence. Emmett unsaddled Thunder, rubbed him down, and made sure he had feed and water before entering the cabin. Inside, he lit a lantern, the flame illuminating the sparse interior. Maggie's things were still exactly as she'd left them, her shawl draped over the chair, her book of poetry on the small table beside her bed, her collection of pressed wildflowers. He couldn't bear to touch any of it. Instead, he poured himself a generous measure of whiskey and slumped into a chair. Tomorrow, he decided, he would ride into town for supplies, maybe take on some work. Anything to keep moving forward. Dawn broke clear and cold over the Montana hills. Emmett had slept fitfully, plagued by dreams of Maggie calling to him from somewhere he couldn't reach. He rose, splashed water on his face, and prepared for the trip to Silverdale, the nearest settlement. The 10-mile ride gave him time to think, to plan. He had some money saved, not much, but enough to get by for a while if he was careful. He could sell some of the furniture they'd brought from back east. Maggie wouldn't mind. She'd always been practical that way. Silverdale had sprung up around a small silver mining operation 5 years earlier. It wasn't much a general store, a saloon, a small hotel, a livery, and a handful of other businesses that served the surrounding homesteaders and the workers from the mine. But it was civilization of a sort. Emmett tied Thunder outside the general store and pushed through the door, the little bell above it announcing his arrival. The familiar smell of coffee, leather, tobacco, and various dry goods greeted him. "Emmett," called Albert Simmons, the proprietor, from behind the counter. "Been wondering when we'd see you. How's your sister faring?" Emmett removed his hat, running a hand through his dark hair. "She passed 2 days ago, Albert. Buried her up in the hills overlooking our place." Albert's face fell. "I'm mighty sorry to hear that, son. She was a fine lady, your sister. Always had a kind word for everyone." "That she did," Emmett agreed, his throat tight. "What can I do for you today?" Albert asked, sensing Emmett's discomfort. "Need the usual supplies," Emmett said, placing his hat on the counter. "Flour, coffee, bacon, beans, and I'm looking for work." "Anything come up recently?" Albert scratched his beard thoughtfully. "As a matter of fact, Matt Jenkins was in here yesterday saying he needed an extra hand at his ranch for a spell. His regular man broke his leg in a fall, might be worth asking about. "I'll do that," Emmett said, nodding his thanks. As Albert gathered Emmett's supplies, the store's bell jingled again and a woman entered. Emmett turned, instinctively stepping aside to make room. She was tall for a woman, with auburn hair tucked neatly beneath a practical bonnet. Her dress was simple but well-made, a deep blue that complemented her fair complexion. What struck Emmett most, however, were her eyes, a clear, intelligent green that assessed the store and its occupants with a single, sweeping glance. "Miss Valencia," Albert greeted her warmly. "Right on time." "Mr. Simmons," she replied with a small smile. Her voice carried a hint of an accent Emmett couldn't quite place. "I hope the books I ordered have arrived." "Indeed they have, just yesterday. Let me finish with Mr. Fitzgerald here and I'll fetch them for you." The woman, Miss Valencia, turned her gaze to Emmett. "Please, don't let me interrupt your business." "No interruption," Emmett assured her, suddenly aware of his trail-worn appearance. He'd been so focused on his grief that he hadn't bothered to shave or change into fresh clothes before riding into town. Albert completed Emmett's order, wrapping the supplies in brown paper. "That'll be $3.45, Emmett." As Emmett counted out the money, he noticed Miss Valencia examining a display of gardening tools with apparent interest. "You garden, miss?" he found himself asking. She looked up, seemingly surprised by the question. "I'm attempting to, Mr. Fitzgerald. I've recently moved here from Boston and find the growing conditions somewhat challenging." "The soil's good in these parts," Emmett said, "but the season's short. Best to start seedlings indoors before the last frost." "I'll remember that, thank you." Her smile was polite but reserved. Emmett collected his packages and nodded a goodbye to Albert. As he headed for the door, something made him turn back. "Miss Valencia, if you need any help with that garden, my place is about 10 miles southwest of town, the Fitzgerald homestead." She regarded him curiously for a moment before responding. "That's very kind, Mr. Fitzgerald." With a nod, Emmett left the store, wondering at his own impulse. He hadn't extended such an invitation to anyone since he and Maggie had settled here. Perhaps it was simply the loneliness already setting in, or maybe something about the woman's determined yet slightly out of place demeanor reminded him of his sister when they'd first arrived. After stowing his supplies in his saddlebags, Emmett headed for the Jenkins Ranch. It was a substantial spread about 3 miles north of town, one of the more successful cattle operations in the territory. Matt Jenkins had come from Texas after the war with a small herd and had built it into something impressive. The ranch house came into view as Emmett crested a small rise. It was a proper 2-story affair with a wide porch and several outbuildings. A bunkhouse for the hands, a barn, corrals, and various sheds dotted the property. Several men were working with horses in one of the corrals as Emmett approached. Matt Jenkins himself was overseeing the work, his tall frame leaning against the corral fence. He was in his 50s, with graying hair beneath his wide-brimmed hat and a face weathered by years in the sun. "Mr. Jenkins," Emmett called as he dismounted. Jenkins turned, studying Emmett for a moment before recognition dawned. "Fitzgerald Wright, the homesteader from the South Valley." "That's right," Emmett confirmed, extending his hand. Jenkins shook it firmly. "What brings you out this way? Heard you might be looking for some temporary help." "I'm interested if the offer still stands." Jenkins scrutinized him. "You know much about cattle?" "Enough," Emmett said. "Worked a cattle drive from Kansas to Abilene before settling here. Can ride, rope, brand, and don't mind the dirty work." Jenkins nodded slowly. "Sorry to hear about your sister. News travels fast in these parts." "Thank you," Emmett replied stiffly. "Could use a good man," Jenkins continued, sensing Emmett's discomfort with the subject. "Pays fair $1.50 a day plus meals. Work starts at sunup, ends when the day's work is done." "Can you start tomorrow?" "I can." "Good. Report to Tom Calloway, my foreman. He'll show you the ropes." Jenkins extended his hand again. "Welcome aboard, Fitzgerald." The ride back to his homestead felt lighter somehow. The prospect of work hard, physical labor that would exhaust him enough to sleep without dreams was welcome. And there was comfort in knowing he'd be around other people, even if only during working hours. As Emmett approached his cabin, however, the weight of loss settled over him again. The empty building stood as a reminder of everything he'd lost. For a moment, he considered turning around, riding back to town, getting drunk at the saloon, and finding a room at the hotel. But that wasn't what Maggie would have wanted. "You'll visit together someday," her voice whispered in his memory. He unsaddled Thunder, tended to him, and carried his supplies inside. As he put away the provisions, his gaze fell on Maggie's Bible sitting on the small shelf above her bed. He walked over and picked it up, the leather binding smooth from years of handling. Opening it randomly, his eyes fell on a passage she had underlined. "For everything there is a season, and a time for every purpose under heaven." Emmett closed the Bible gently and returned it to its place. Tomorrow would be a new season, a new beginning. He would honor Maggie's memory by living as she had asked. The following weeks fell into a rhythm. Emmett would rise before dawn, ride to the Jenkins ranch, work until dusk, and return home exhausted. The physical labor was exactly what he needed, rounding up strays, mending fences, branding calves, and all the countless tasks required to keep a cattle operation running smoothly. The other hands were a rough but decent lot. They respected hard work and kept their distance when Emmett wasn't in a talking mood, which was most of the time. Tom Calloway, the foreman, was a fair man who recognized Emmett's competence and increasingly gave him more responsibility. It was nearly 3 weeks after he started at the ranch when Emmett encountered Miss Valencia again. He was in town on an errand for Jenkins, picking up supplies at the general store, when he spotted her examining seed packets on a display near the window. "Having any luck with that garden?" he asked, approaching her. She looked up, recognition flickering in her eyes. "Mr. Fitzgerald, yes, somewhat, though I fear the rabbits are enjoying my efforts more than I am." Emmett smiled, the expression feeling strange on his face after so many weeks of grief. "You need a good fence." "Or a dog. I've considered both, but haven't yet acted on either suggestion." She selected a packet of carrot seeds and added it to the small basket on her arm. "I understand you're working for Mr. Jenkins now." "Word travels," Emmett observed. "It does indeed in a place this size." She hesitated, then added, "I was sorry to hear about your sister, Mr. Fitzgerald. Mr. Simmons mentioned it when I asked after you." Emmett's smile faded. "Thank you." An awkward silence fell between them. "I don't believe I've properly introduced myself," she said finally. "Marianne Valencia." "Emmett Fitzgerald," he replied, though she clearly already knew his name. "You mentioned you're from Boston. What brings you all the way out here, if you don't mind my asking?" "My father was a professor of literature at Harvard," she explained. "When he passed away last year, I discovered I'd inherited a modest sum, but not enough to maintain our home in Cambridge. I've always been drawn to the idea of the West, so I decided to make a fresh start." "Alone?" Emmett couldn't hide his surprise. Single women didn't often venture to the territories unaccompanied. Marianne's chin lifted slightly. "Yes, alone. I'm 28, Mr. Fitzgerald, well past the age where I require a chaperone." "I didn't mean to offend," Emmett said quickly. "It's just unusual is all. Most folks come out here with family or to join family already settled." "I have neither luxury," she replied. "But I've secured a position teaching at the school that's being established here. The children deserve an education, even on the frontier." Emmett nodded. He'd heard talk of the town's efforts to build a proper school. Until now, children had been taught informally by whoever had the knowledge and inclination. "That's admirable," he said sincerely. "It's necessary," she countered, but her expression softened. "Have you always been a rancher, Mr. Fitzgerald?" "No, madam. Fought in the war, then tried my hand at various things before my sister and I decided to homestead out here. I'm still learning." "As are we all," she said with a small smile. "Well, I should complete my purchases." "Good day, Mr. Fitzgerald." "Miss Valencia," he responded with a nod, watching as she moved to the counter where Albert waited. There was something intriguing about Marianne Valencia, Emmett thought as he collected his own items. A determination and self-sufficiency that was rare, even in a place where those qualities were essential for survival. And beneath her proper Boston exterior, he sensed a kind of loneliness that resonated with his own. On his ride back to the ranch, Emmett found himself thinking about her garden and her struggle with rabbits. It was such a simple problem, one easily solved with the right knowledge. Before he quite realized what he was doing, he'd made a decision. The following Sunday, his one day off, Emmett loaded his wagon with tools, some spare lumber, and chicken wire he'd purchased in town. The drive to Marianne Valencia's small house on the outskirts of Silverdale took less than an hour. Her home was modest but neat, a simple one-story structure with a small porch. Behind it, he could see the struggling garden she'd mentioned, partially eaten plants in neat rows. As he pulled up, Marianne emerged from the house, clearly surprised to see him. "Mr. Fitzgerald," she called, shielding her eyes from the morning sun. "This is unexpected." Emmett climbed down from the wagon, suddenly feeling foolish. He should have sent word ahead, not just appeared on her doorstep. "Miss Valencia, I apologize for arriving unannounced. I thought I might help with your rabbit problem." She approached, dressed simply in a calico dress, her auburn hair pulled back in a practical bun. "You came all this way to help with my garden." Put that way, it did sound ridiculous. Emmett gestured at his wagon. "Brought some chicken wire and posts. Thought I could put up a fence for you, keep the critters out." Marianne studied him for a moment, then smiled. "That's very kind, Mr. Fitzgerald. I would appreciate the assistance if you're certain you can spare the time." "Wouldn't be here if I couldn't," he said, relieved she hadn't turned him away. "Would you care for some coffee before you begin? I just brewed a pot." "That would be welcome, thank you." He followed her inside, removing his hat as he entered. The interior of the house was modest but comfortable, with simple furnishings and bookshelves lining one wall, filled to capacity. "You weren't exaggerating about being the daughter of a literature professor," Emmett remarked, eyeing the collection. Marianne smiled as she poured coffee into 2 cups. "Books have always been my greatest companions. I couldn't bear to part with them, even though transporting them here cost more than I care to admit." She handed him a cup, and their fingers brushed momentarily. Emmett felt an unexpected jolt at the contact. It had been so long since he'd touched another person, aside from the occasional handshake with the ranch hands. "Thank you," he said, his voice rougher than he intended. He cleared his throat. "Your home is nice." "It's coming along," she replied, gesturing for him to sit at the small table. "I've been here only 2 months, and there's still much to be done." "The school?" Emmett asked, taking a seat. "Construction begins next week. Until the building is complete, I'll be holding classes here for the few students who can attend. 5 children so far, ranging in age from 6 to 14. That's ambitious." Marianne's eyes lit up with passion. "Education is the foundation of civilization, Mr. Fitzgerald. These children deserve the same opportunities as those in eastern cities." "Can't argue with that," Emmett agreed, sipping his coffee. It was good, strong, and hot, just how he liked it. "My sister was always after me to read more, said it would improve my mind." "Your sister sounds like a wise woman." "She was," Emmett said quietly, "the smartest person I knew." Marianne seemed to sense his shift in mood. "Tell me about this fence you're planning to build." Grateful for the change of subject, Emmett explained his idea for a simple but effective barrier around her garden. They finished their coffee, and he got to work while Marianne continued with her own Sunday tasks, occasionally bringing him water or checking on his progress. By mid-afternoon, the fence was complete, a sturdy enclosure of chicken wire supported by wooden posts driven deep into the ground, with the wire extending several inches below the surface to prevent rabbits from digging under. "There," Emmett said, standing back to admire his work. "That should keep the varmints out." Marianne joined him, genuinely pleased. "It's perfect, Mr. Fitzgerald. I can't thank you enough." "Emmett," he said suddenly. "My friends call me Emmett." She regarded him with those clear green eyes. "Are we friends then?" "I'd like to think so," he replied honestly. A small smile tugged at her lips. "Then I insist you call me Marianne." "Marianne," he repeated, liking the way her name felt. "Would you allow me to help you replant some of what the rabbits destroyed? I brought some seedlings from my own garden, ones Maggie started before." He trailed off. "I would be honored," Marianne said softly. They spent the next hour working side by side, digging small holes and carefully transferring the young plants from Emmett's wagon to Marianne's newly protected garden. There was something peaceful about the work, something healing in the simple act of placing life into the ground and nurturing it. "These should do well," Emmett said as they finished. "The soil's good here." "Thanks to your expertise, I might actually have vegetables this year," Marianne replied, brushing dirt from her hands. "Would you stay for supper, Emmett? It's the least I can offer in return for your help." The invitation surprised him. He hadn't planned to stay this long, hadn't anticipated anything beyond building the fence. But the thought of returning to his empty cabin held little appeal compared to sharing a meal with this intriguing woman. "I'd be pleased to," he said. Marianne proved to be as skilled in the kitchen as she was with books. The meal was simple roast chicken, potatoes, and greens, but prepared with care. They talked easily as they ate, discovering shared interests despite their different backgrounds. "So you fought for the Union," Marianne said as they finished their meal. Emmett nodded. "Enlisted in '63 right after I turned 18, served until the end." "My brother fought as well," she said. "He didn't return." "I'm sorry," Emmett said sincerely. "Too many didn't." "It seems we've both known loss," Marianne observed. "It's the one thing most folks out here have in common," Emmett replied. "Everyone's running from something or someone they've lost." "Is that why you came west, to escape loss?" Emmett considered the question. "Partly. After the war, nothing felt right back home in Ohio. Maggie was all the family I had left, and she was as restless as I was. We thought we could make a fresh start out here. And did you? Before she fell ill, I mean." "For a while," Emmett said, his eyes distant with memory. "Those first 2 years were good. Hard work, but good. Maggie loved it here, the open space, the mountains, the wildflowers in spring. She used to say she felt closer to God in these hills than she ever did in church." Marianne reached across the table and briefly touched his hand. "She sounds remarkable." "She was," Emmett agreed, surprised to find he could speak of Maggie without the crushing weight of grief. "What about you? Is running a frontier school what you imagined when you left Boston?" Marianne laughed softly. "Hardly. I imagined something a bit more established. But there's satisfaction in building something from nothing. These children are eager to learn, and their parents value education even if they haven't had much themselves." "Noble work," Emmett said. "Necessary work," she corrected, echoing their earlier conversation, "as is yours. Ranching feeds people. When the cattle don't die and the market prices hold," Emmett replied with a wry smile. As dusk fell, Emmett reluctantly rose to leave. "I should be getting back. Early start tomorrow." Marianne walked him to his wagon. "Thank you again for the fence and the seedlings." "It was a kindness I won't forget." "My pleasure," Emmett said, meaning it. He hesitated, then added, "Perhaps I could call on you again. Check on how the garden's doing." "I'd like that," Marianne replied, her expression warm in the fading light. Emmett climbed into his wagon, tipped his hat, and set off toward his homestead, his mind filled with thoughts of auburn hair and intelligent green eyes. It had been a good day. He realized the first truly good day since Maggie's passing. As spring turned to summer, Emmett found himself making the journey to Silverdale with increasing frequency. What began as occasional visits to check on Marianne's garden evolved into regular Sunday dinners, long conversations on her porch, and eventually, walks along the creek that ran near the edge of town. He learned that she was the youngest of 3 children, that she had taught at a girls' school in Boston for 5 years before coming west, that she could recite Shakespeare from memory, and that despite her refined upbringing, she wasn't afraid to get her hands dirty or speak her mind. In turn, he shared stories of his childhood in Ohio, his experiences during the war, though only the lighter moments, and tales of his and Maggie's journey west and their early days homesteading. He found himself laughing again, remembering the good times rather than dwelling on the loss. The ranch hands noticed the change in him. Tom Calloway commented on it one evening as they finished repairing a section of fence that had been damaged during a thunderstorm. "You're looking better these days, Fitzgerald," the foreman observed, "less like a man at his own funeral." Emmett drove the last post into the ground with more force than necessary. "Don't know what you're talking about," Calloway chuckled. "Sure you don't. Word is you've been spending time with that schoolteacher from back east." "Miss Valencia is a friend," Emmett said firmly, "if you say so." Calloway gathered his tools. "Whatever she is, she's good for you. Haven't seen you crack a smile since you started here until these past few weeks." Emmett didn't respond, but the foreman's words stayed with him. Was it that obvious? And what exactly was happening between him and Marianne? The question lingered as July turned to August. The days were long and hot, the work at the ranch relentless as they prepared for the fall roundup. But each Sunday without fail, Emmett would clean up, put on his best shirt, and ride to Marianne's house. On one such Sunday in late August, they were walking along the creek. the water lower than usual due to the summer heat. Marianne was telling him about her students' progress and the challenges of teaching children of different ages and abilities in one room. Jimmy Carson can barely sit still for 5 minutes, she was saying, but give him a problem involving numbers and he's completely focused. And little Sarah Miller, she's only 6, but she reads better than some of the older children. Sounds like you know them well, Emmett observed. I try to understand each child's strengths and weaknesses, Marianne replied. It's the only way to teach effectively. They reached a bend in the creek where a large cottonwood provided welcome shade. Emmett spread his coat on the ground and they sat, watching the water flow lazily past. The school building is coming along nicely, Marianne continued. It should be ready by the time winter arrives. That's good, Emmett said, though his mind was elsewhere. He'd been thinking about something for weeks now, turning it over in his mind until he'd reached a decision. Marianne, there's something I'd like to show you if you're willing. She turned to him, curiosity in her eyes. What is it? It's a bit of a ride from here. We'd need to take my wagon. When? Now, if you're agreeable, we'd be back well before dark. Marianne studied him for a moment. This seems important to you. It is, Emmett admitted. Then of course I'll come. They returned to Marianne's house, where she changed into a sturdier pair of shoes and left a note for one of her students who was supposed to drop off some assignments later. Then they set off in Emmett's wagon, heading southwest out of town. The ride was mostly silent, each lost in their own thoughts. Emmett wondered if he was making a mistake, if it was too soon, too personal, but something told him it was right. As they approached his homestead, Marianne sat up straighter, taking in the modest cabin, the small barn, the fields beyond where crops grew in neat rows despite his frequent absence. This is your home, she said softly. Yes, Emmett replied, pulling the wagon to a stop near the cabin. But that's not what I wanted to show you. He helped her down, then retrieved something from inside the cabin, a bouquet of wildflowers he'd gathered that morning before heading to town. This way, he said, leading her toward a path that wound up into the hills behind the homestead. The climb was steep in places, but Marianne kept pace without complaint. As they neared the top, Emmett slowed, suddenly uncertain. Emmett, Marianne said gently, where are we going? He took a deep breath. To visit my sister, understanding dawned in her eyes. Are you sure you want me there? I'm sure, he said, finding that it was true. She would have liked you. You remind me of her in some ways, your determination, your intelligence. Marianne touched his arm, a gesture of support. They continued up the path until they reached the clearing where Maggie's grave lay. The wooden cross still stood, though the elements had weathered it somewhat. The view was spectacular, rolling hills giving way to distant mountains, the valley spread out below. It's beautiful, Marianne breathed. She chose it, Emmett said, approaching the grave. Said she wanted to be able to see forever. He knelt and placed the wildflowers at the base of the cross. Hello, Maggie, he said softly. I've brought someone to meet you. Marianne hung back, giving him a moment of privacy. Then, at his beckoning gesture, she came forward and knelt beside him. Hello, Margaret, she said to the grave. Your brother has told me so much about you. They stayed for a time, Emmett sharing stories about Maggie that he hadn't told Marianne before, how she'd once chased off a bear with nothing but a frying pan and her loud voice. How she'd taught herself to play the harmonica during the long winter evenings. How she'd never lost faith, even when it seemed the world was determined to break them. As the sun began its westward descent, casting long shadows across the hillside, Emmett finally stood. We should head back. Marianne rose as well, brushing grass from her skirt. Thank you for bringing me here, Emmett. It means a great deal that you would share this with me. Before we go, Emmett said, there's something else I should tell you, something Maggie said before she died. Marianne waited expectantly. She told me you'll visit together someday, just not yet. At the time, I didn't understand what she meant. I thought perhaps she was delirious from the fever. He looked out over the valley, then back to Marianne. But I've been thinking lately that maybe she somehow knew that I wouldn't be alone forever. Marianne's eyes widened slightly. Emmett. I'm not asking for anything, Marianne, he said quickly. I just wanted you to know that bringing you here feels right. Maggie would approve, I think. Marianne stepped closer and, to his surprise, took his hand in hers. I'm honored, she said simply. They stood that way for a moment, hand in hand, with the vast Montana landscape spread before them and the setting sun painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. On the ride back to town, Something had shifted between them. There was a new understanding, an unspoken acknowledgement of feelings that had been growing for months. As September gave way to October, their relationship deepened. Emmett began making improvements to his homestead that had been neglected since Maggie's illness, fixing the leaky roof, reinforcing the barn, clearing more land for planting. He didn't articulate, even to himself, why these tasks suddenly seemed urgent. Meanwhile, Marianne's school officially opened in the new building at the beginning of October. Emmett attended the small ceremony, watching with pride as she cut the ribbon and welcomed 23 students, more than double her initial enrollment, into the one-room schoolhouse. "You've accomplished something remarkable," he told her afterward as townspeople mingled in the schoolyard, sharing refreshments and admiring the new structure. "We've only just begun," Marianne replied, but her eyes shone with satisfaction. "There's still so much to do: books to acquire, a proper bell for the tower, perhaps even a piano someday." "One step at a time," Emmett said, smiling at her enthusiasm. "Indeed." She glanced around to ensure they weren't overheard, then lowered her voice. "I've been invited to dinner at the Jenkins Ranch next Saturday. Mrs. Jenkins was most insistent that I attend, saying there would be suitable company present." Emmett raised an eyebrow. "Suitable company?" "I believe she's attempting to introduce me to eligible bachelors," Marianne said with a hint of amusement. "Apparently, a single woman of my age is cause for concern among the local matrons." An unexpected surge of jealousy flared in Emmett's chest. "And will you go?" "I've accepted the invitation, yes. It would be impolite to refuse, and Mrs. Jenkins has been very supportive of the school." Marianne studied his face. "Does that trouble you?" Emmett hesitated, then decided on honesty. "I don't much like the idea of you being paraded before suitable men." A slow smile spread across Marianne's face. "Then perhaps you should do something about it, Mr. Fitzgerald." Before he could respond, one of her students called for her attention, and she moved away, leaving Emmett to ponder her challenging words. The following week passed in a blur of activity. The ranch was busy with preparations for the fall cattle drive to the railroad at Miles City, where the animals would be loaded onto trains bound for eastern markets. Emmett worked from sunup to sundown, falling into bed each night exhausted. But Marianne's words and the dinner at the Jenkins Ranch remained at the forefront of his mind. By Friday, he'd made a decision. After finishing his work, he rode into town and made 2 stops, first at the general store, then at the barber shop for a much-needed haircut and shave. Saturday evening found him standing on Marianne's porch, freshly groomed, wearing his best clothes and holding a small package wrapped in brown paper. He knocked, heart racing like he was 18 again, waiting for a girl to accompany him to a dance. Marianne opened the door, already dressed for the dinner at the Jenkins Ranch in a becoming green dress that brought out the color of her eyes. Her hair was arranged more elaborately than usual, with small combs holding it in place. "Emmett," she said, clearly surprised, "I wasn't expecting you." "I know," he replied, suddenly nervous. "I was hoping to speak with you before you left for the Jenkinses." She stepped back, inviting him in. "Of course, is everything all right?" Emmett entered, removing his hat. "Everything's fine, better than fine, actually." He took a deep breath. "Marianne, I've been doing a lot of thinking since our conversation at the school opening." "Have you?" she said, her expression giving nothing away. "I have," he confirmed. "You asked me if it troubled me, the idea of you meeting suitable men. It does, more than I care to admit. Because the truth is, I can't imagine anyone more suitable for you than me." Marianne's composure slipped, her eyes widening. "Emmett," he held up a hand, "please let me finish before I lose my nerve." He extended the small package. "This is for you." With slightly trembling fingers, Marianne unwrapped the paper to reveal a small wooden box, intricately carved with a pattern of flowers. Opening it, she found a simple gold ring with a single pearl. "It was my mother's," Emmett explained. "Maggie kept it safe all these years, said I should give it to the right woman when the time came." Marianne looked up at him, her eyes glistening. "I'm not a wealthy man," Emmett continued. "I can't offer you the comforts you might have known in Boston. But I can promise to work hard, to be honest and faithful, and to love you with everything I am for as long as I live." He took another deep breath. "Marianne Valencia, will you marry me?" For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, Marianne simply looked at him, her expression unreadable. Then slowly a smile spread across her face. "Yes," she said, her voice steady and sure. "Yes, Emmett Fitzgerald, I will marry you." Relief and joy washed over him. He stepped forward, took the ring from the box, and slid it onto her finger. It fit perfectly, as if it had been made for her. "I've never been more certain of anything in my life," Marianne said, looking up at him with shining eyes. Emmett drew her into his arms, and when their lips met, it felt like coming home after a long journey. Later, after Marianne had sent a message to the Jenkinses declining their dinner invitation, citing a sudden development that required her attention, they sat together on her porch, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. "When should we marry?" Emmett asked, her hand clasped in his. "Soon," Marianne replied without hesitation. "Before winter sets in. I've never been fond of long engagements." "Nor I," Emmett agreed with a smile. "November, then, after the cattle drive. November would be perfect." She turned to face him. "Where will we live?" "Your homestead or my house here in town?" It was a practical question, one Emmett had already considered. "I thought perhaps both for now. You need to be near the school during the week, but we could spend weekends and holidays at the homestead. Eventually, if we have children, we might need to decide more permanently." Marianne's expression softened at the mention of children. "I'd like that, having both worlds, the community of town and the peace of your land." They talked late into the night, making plans, sharing hopes, building a future together word by word. When Emmett finally left, promising to return the next day, he felt lighter than he had in years, as if a burden he hadn't fully acknowledged had been lifted from his shoulders. News of their engagement spread quickly through Silverdale. Most reactions were positive. Marianne had become a respected figure in the community through her work with the school, and Emmett was known as a hardworking, honest man. Albert Simmons at the general store offered them a wedding gift of a new set of dishes. Tom Calloway promised Emmett time off for a proper honeymoon. Even Matt Jenkins, after expressing mock disappointment that Marianne wouldn't be meeting his wife's chosen, suitable candidates, gave them his blessing and a fine heifer as a wedding present. The preparations consumed the next few weeks. Emmett completed the cattle drive in record time, pushing himself and the other hands to return before the first snow. Marianne arranged for a substitute teacher for the week following the wedding. Together, they readied both homes for their shared life, moving some of Marianne's books to the homestead, making space in her house for Emmett's few possessions. They decided on a simple ceremony at the church in town, followed by a celebration at the schoolhouse. Marianne wrote to her remaining family in Boston, though she knew they wouldn't be able to attend on such short notice. Emmett had no family to invite, but the ranch hands and various townspeople had become something of a surrogate family over the years. 2 days before the wedding, Emmett took Marianne to visit Maggie's grave again. The November air was crisp, the trees bare, but the view was as magnificent as ever. They stood side by side, Emmett's arm around Marianne's shoulders. "I wish she could be there on Saturday," Emmett said quietly. "She will be, in a way," Marianne replied, leaning into him. "Through the ring, through your memories, through the love she had for you that helped make you the man you are." Emmett looked down at her, wondering how he had been fortunate enough to find someone who understood him so completely. "You know, when Maggie said we'd visit together someday, I think she meant you and me here. I think somehow she knew." "Perhaps she did," Marianne said, "or perhaps she simply knew you well enough to know you would find love again given time." They placed fresh evergreen boughs at the base of the cross, a gesture of remembrance and continuity. As they prepared to leave, Emmett felt a sense of peace settle over him. "Goodbye for now, Maggie," he said softly. "I'll be back with my wife next time." November 18, 1876, dawned clear and cold, with a light dusting of snow on the ground, the first of the season. Emmett awoke at his homestead, where he'd spent the night at Tom Calloway's insistence that it was bad luck to see the bride before the wedding. He dressed with care in the new suit he'd ordered from back east, the fabric stiff and unfamiliar. His hands trembled slightly as he fastened his tie, not from doubt, but from the enormity of the step he was about to take. A knock at the door announced Calloway's arrival. The foreman had agreed to stand up with Emmett during the ceremony. "Ready for the big day?" Tom asked as Emmett let him in. "As ready as I'll ever be," Emmett replied. "Got the ring?" Emmett patted his pocket, where a simple gold band purchased from a jeweler in Miles City during the cattle drive rested securely. Right here. Then let's get you to town before Miss Valencia thinks you've changed your mind. The ride to Silverdale seemed both endless and too brief. Emmett's mind raced with thoughts of the future, the home they would build together, the family they might have, the life they would share. For the first time since Maggie's death, he looked forward with hope instead of merely existing day to day. The church was filled when they arrived, townspeople and ranch hands alike dressed in their Sunday best. Emmett took his place at the front, beside the minister with Tom at his side. The small organ began to play, and everyone rose and turned toward the back of the church. Marianne appeared in the doorway, a vision in a cream-colored dress with lace at the collar and cuffs. She carried a bouquet of pine branches and the last of the fall roses, preserved carefully for this occasion. Albert Simmons escorted her down the aisle, standing in for her absent father. Emmett couldn't take his eyes off her. As she reached him and took his hands, he saw in her face everything he'd ever wanted: acceptance, understanding, and above all, love. The ceremony itself passed in a blur. Emmett spoke his vows clearly, though his voice threatened to break with emotion. Marianne's responses were steady and sure, her eyes never leaving his. The exchange of rings, the minister's pronouncement, the kiss that sealed their union all seemed to happen both in slow motion and in an instant. And then they were walking back down the aisle together, husband and wife, into a future neither could have imagined just months before. The celebration at the schoolhouse continued well into the evening. There was food prepared by the women of the town, music provided by a fiddle player from the ranch and a pianist from the saloon, and more good wishes than Emmett could have imagined receiving. He and Marianne danced, ate, accepted congratulations, and finally slipped away as the festivities continued without them. They spent their wedding night at Marianne's house in town, which had been prepared for them by several of her students' mothers' fresh linens on the bed, a fire laid in the hearth, candles placed strategically around the bedroom. Later, as they lay together in the quiet darkness, Marianne's head on his chest, Emmett felt a completeness he'd never known. "Are you happy, Mrs. Fitzgerald?" he asked softly. Marianne propped herself up on one elbow to look at him, her hair falling in auburn waves around her shoulders. "Immeasurably so, Mr. Fitzgerald, and you?" "More than I ever thought possible," he replied, drawing her down for a kiss. The years that followed were not without challenges. The winter of 1876-1877 was particularly harsh, testing their new marriage with bitter cold, deep snow, and isolation. But they weathered it together, Emmett making the dangerous journey between town and the homestead whenever possible, Marianne continuing to teach despite conditions that sometimes meant only a handful of students could attend. Spring brought renewed hope, and an unexpected blessing: Marianne was with child. Their daughter, Margaret Fitzgerald, was born on a beautiful October day in 1877, with auburn hair like her mother's and blue eyes that eventually darkened to her father's brown. They called her Ellie, to distinguish her from her namesake aunt. As Ellie grew, so did the community around them. Silverdale expanded with the arrival of the railroad in 1880, bringing new settlers, businesses, and opportunities. Marianne's school flourished, eventually requiring the hiring of a second teacher. Emmett continued working at the Jenkins Ranch while also developing their homestead, gradually building it into a respectable small ranch of their own. In the spring of 1882, their son, James William Fitzgerald, joined the family, a sturdy boy with his father's dark hair and his mother's green eyes. Marianne took a year away from teaching to care for him, then returned to her beloved school with renewed dedication. Through it all, the joys and sorrows, triumphs and setbacks, Emmett and Marianne's love remained constant, deepening with each passing year. They visited Maggie's grave regularly, sometimes alone, sometimes together, and eventually with their children, sharing stories of the brave, intelligent woman who had loved the Montana hills. On a warm summer evening in 1886, 10 years after Maggie's passing, Emmett and Marianne stood together on the hillside, watching their children place wildflowers on their aunt's grave. Ellie, now 8, was a serious, thoughtful child who loved books as much as her mother did. 4-year-old James was more rambunctious, always exploring, always curious. "Do you think she knows?" Marianne asked softly, leaning against Emmett's shoulder. "That we're happy, that her brother found love again." Emmett wrapped his arm around his wife, watching as Ellie carefully arranged the flowers while explaining to James the importance of remembering family, even those you never met. "I think she knows," he said. "I think that's exactly what she meant when she said we'd visit together someday." Marianne smiled up at him, the years having added subtle lines around her eyes but none of the hardness that frontier life often etched into women's faces. "Not yet," she reminded him, completing Maggie's prophecy. "No," Emmett agreed, pulling her closer. "Not for a very long time yet." As the sun began its descent behind the distant mountains, painting the sky in brilliant hues of orange and pink, the Fitzgerald family gathered together on the hillside, the living honoring the dead, the present acknowledging the past, and all of them facing the future with love and hope. The cowboy had buried his sister in the hills, and though the grief of that day would never completely fade, it had been transformed by time and love into something different, a bittersweet memory that reminded Emmett of both what he had lost and what he had found. And when Maggie had said, "You'll visit together someday, just not yet," she had given him not just a prophecy but a promise that life would continue, that love would return, that happiness could be found again, even in the wake of profound loss. It was a promise that had been fulfilled beyond anything Emmett could have imagined on that lonely day 10 years ago. And for that, he would be forever grateful.